My son screamed, so loud the teacup jumped in my hands. That money was for my in-laws' penthouse. He slammed the door and left me with the echo of his voice like a stone thrown into a quiet pond. I remember the way the sun caught the silver in my old pearls then, how it looked for a moment like something that could still belong to me. I had sold the house. I had thought I was doing a brave, small thing. I had not expected to be accused in my own kitchen of buying someone else's marble floors with my life's slow savings. Do you know that moment when the world tilts and everyone you loved becomes a stranger? That is how the first line of this story begins. People imagine betrayals as sudden guillotine drops. Mine came like water on warm iron, steady, patient, then smoking hot. It began with a mason jar on the windowsill and ended with a signed paper that looked like my own handwriting. I had been a householder for 47 years, sweeping, frying, singing in a small kitchen whose floorboard still remembered my daughter's small feet. My life had been manageable and full of rituals. The chipped mug I drank from every morning, it had a crack like a smile. The mason jar where I dropped spare coins and odd bills for a rainy day. The old pearls my mother left me, kept in a velvet pouch beneath the loose floorboard by the stove. Those were my reliquaries. Every coin a story of sacrifice, every pearl a brief defiance against time. They were small things, unremarkable to the world, monumental to me. My daughter, Lila, lives in a house the size of a chapel. Marble pillars, oil portraits that smile with practiced sympathy. She dresses like a woman who was taught to be admired at every stage. Once, she used to sit on the same worn kitchen chair as I did and ask me how to bake bread. She asked now for advice about art for her foyer and never once inquired into the mason jar. That omission is where the first heartbeat of hurt began. She had love once. Now it was an accessory. It is important to say where I was from. A modest, honest life, not poor in the way that robs people of pride, but poor enough to know how to count each coin. I had one small house left when the sons and daughters of my youth scattered like the seeds of a dandelion. I kept a little garden and a bed that remembered my husband's weight. I wrote letters, simple, fragile scripts, because I believed in the small power of words. One of those letters, dated March 22, 2024, is a key to what comes. I will tell you about that letter later. Before the first storm, there was a pleasant weather. I used to be invited to dinners. I used to be given the warm corner at family gatherings. People imagine elder neglect as a crime scene of abandoned walkers and unpaid bills. It is often a more polite crime. A birthday unmentioned, a chair left empty, a kindly voice that says, "We'll get to Maman next month." I forgave much. Love softens the edges of hurt until the hurt is a pebble you can slip into your pocket and not feel. But pebbles accumulate, and they weigh you down. I had done my best to be both mother and grandmother and, in my more romantic moments, the house's small historian. I kept everything. A catalog of recipes, school photographs, and the little things that remind you who you were before the world asked you to trade your name for convenience. In the top drawer of my kitchen, beside the packet of bus schedules and a catalog from 1999, I kept a folded letter, one that would come to mean the difference between a woman's dignity and her erasure. I read it sometimes like a talisman, and it smelled of lemon and dust. The letter was from my husband, written in a hand I knew better than any weather. He had promised, "If fate makes me leave you, take care of our home." Those words made my hands steady on stormy nights. The ordinary world was simple. I walked to the bakery on Tuesdays at 9. I bought 2 croissants for the price of 1, and I came home to knit while the radio played songs about roads and rememberings. My neighbors knew me. I knew the times the mailman paused and the cat that slept on Mrs. Dalrymple's stoop. In the evenings, I would clean the old mantel and sometimes set the old pearls on my dressing table, letting them dance in the lamplight as if reenacting a life of better things. I sold my house, but not easily. There was a reason why I should have kept it. That house was the last kingdom where my memory reigned unchallenged. The decision was like cutting one of my own fingers. But I had reasons, a doctor's bill, a vanishing ability to climb my stairs. and the stubborn remnant of pride that does not want to be dependent upon charity. I made the choice on a rainy April morning, April 3rd, 2024, a day that will have lines in my bones forever. I signed the grant deed at 3:15 p.m., and the buyer paid about $230,000. I remember the figure as if saying it aloud would reattach the house to me. The bank issued the cashier's check with a blue stamp and the notation, "Sale finalized 2024-0403. I watched the ink dry. Why sell? Because the roof was leaking, and because my son Mark's coffee shop had been slow, and because the surgeon's office sent letters with unadorned instructions. Do you really want to see an old woman become a ward of others because she refuses to sell her roof? I did not. I wanted independence, a small apartment with soft carpets and a balcony where I could grow herbs. I wanted to keep the pearls, and perhaps with the money, replace my cracked mug. I told Lila about this. I expected a call of concern, a carriage of assistance. I expected at the very least a warm voice saying, "Mother, are you sure?" Instead, her silence arrived like a formal RSVP declined. There were small slights at first, an unreturned phone call, a luncheon I was not invited to, a photograph removed from the mantel. When I came to visit one Sunday, April 5th, 2 days after the sale, she greeted me with polite surprise and a coolness that tasted of sugarless tea. "I heard you sold the house," she said, fingers drumming a rhythm on a silver tray. "How liberating for you." The house smelled of lilies and lemon polish. There were new curtains and a runner where once there had been an old rug stained with jam. "Yes," I said. "I needed to." The roof, I told her the practicalities. I told her the grant deed, the date, the amount. She smiled without moving her eyes. "Isn't it wonderful that you can manage? Of course you will need a place to stay," she said. "You will need like a verdict." I felt the old pebble. "I'll be fine," I said. This was the first time I felt truly small in my daughter's presence. That night, at my small rented room, I opened the mason jar. I counted. The coins were less than they had been the week before. I used some at the pharmacist. I took my pearls out and held them like a prayer. How strange that a chain of little things can make a life. When you are older, you accumulate more than objects. You accumulate stories and proofs and a long, slow ledger of who you were to others. The chain of betrayals began with a whisper. A family friend, Mrs. Lemoyne, called in late May and said in a voice that trembled like mine, "Have you signed anything else, dear?" I remembered the durable power of attorney. Someone at the bank had asked if I wanted one when I went to change the names on my account. And I, tired, had signed it on March 28th, 2024. I had thought it practical. I had thought it would save my son the trouble of endless trips. The document said, in plain bureaucratic terms, that I appointed a person to act on my behalf should I become incapacitated. I had written Lila's name there because she was the one who always answered the phone. Had I been foolish? The durable power of attorney is an instrument both simple and treacherous. It is the sort of thing you sign with the best of intentions, and later find the clauses have teeth. It was not until a week later that I saw the first real fracture. A letter that had been delivered to the wrong address and ended up at my neighbor's house. I picked it up with a trembling hand. The envelope was addressed to Lila, but not in my daughter's hand. It was typed official with a stamped seal. Inside was a notice. Transfer of beneficial interest, certificate of trust amendment. It mentioned a penthouse and a name I recognized, the surname of Lila's in-laws, the Duvant. The letter had a date, April 1st, 2024. I put the paper to my face and smelled printer ink like a hospital corridor. I read it 3 times. It dared to imply that funds were being arranged for a new property. My heart, an old clock, skipped several ticks. I called Mark and asked, "Who is paying for the penthouse?" Mark had one of those gentle, unsubstantial voices when he refuses to see the hard edges of things. He said, "Mother, Lila says the Duvants have put down something for their place. Isn't that lovely? Is it lovely to watch a mother be swept aside?" I wondered. When I confronted Lila, she laughed in a way I remember from when she was 7 and had been caught with jam on her cheek. "It's not your business, Maman." Do you think you sold that little house and I don't know the reasons people do such things? You should be happy we have a roof to gossip about. I did not point out that none of the gossip had ever included me. I let the silence be a small, sharp thing, but inside I boxed a determination. It begins, you must understand, with a small private vow, one clasped to the chest like an heirloom. My vow that evening was to find out what papers had passed through hands that had once been my own. I found a document that did not belong to me. There, short and cold, a line that would later make the rest of the world feel like a stage. Power to amend trust, authorized signatory Lila Duvant. It was a simple clause with a monstrous weight. How could a trust be amended without my knowledge when it concerned the distribution of funds that had, until that moment, been mine or mine to control? Was there a forged induction? A changed will? The room went hazy. I began to watch the house like a detective in slippers. People do not suspect their own kin of plot-making. It is a cruelty reserved for novels. But grief does teach you certain attentions. How a door closes, how a laugh lingers too long, how a hand will not rest on your sleeve. I began to follow small evidence, receipts for furniture, bank notices, a photograph where my face had been cropped out. Each scrape and omission was a map to a betrayal. At the community legal clinic, I tried to make sense of the documents. The counselor there, Mr. Patel, whose hair is mostly gray and whose hands smell of lemon and leather, saw the durable power of attorney and the certificate of trust. He frowned the particular frown of men who have seen good deeds turned sour. "Mrs. Laurent," he said, "people with access can, in some cases, change documents if they have a grant deed or if the trust allows amendment. There are also instances of undue influence and—" He paused. "And?" I asked. My hands were damp. The chipped mug on the clinic table seemed larger than usual, like a moon. "And you must be careful. If there was a new grant deed recorded, a transfer certificate signed, and if funds moved after April 1st, 2024, we have to get copies from the county recorder's office. You will need IDs, affidavits. This could become a legal matter." He said the words legal matter with the gravity of someone mentioning a cold season. That night, I went home and laid out my small documents like a ragged glimmer. The mason jar, half full now from my paying for bus tickets, glinted absurdly. The pearls lay like a constellation. I held the letter from my husband and read his script until the ink blurred. The house that had been my fortress was suddenly a ledger of debts and trusts and clauses I had never intended to learn. Someone else's signature stared back at me. I taught myself patience. It is an old woman's discipline, the way we wait for tea to cool, for bread to rise, for the grandchildren to arrive. I waited and I listened. In June, at a garden party Lila hosted, I was not invited. I learned of it only through a casual mention from a cousin. Lila's friend congratulated her on a marvelous investment. The friend said, "If only everyone had the sense to redeploy assets so cleverly." The phrase, redeploy assets, has the blandness of accountants and the cruelty of decisions made behind closed doors. I observed, like one takes in a play, the house full of laughter, the portraits looking down like judges, and Lila, who moved like a woman convinced of her own unassailability. When I asked Mark about the funds, he looked at me with the kind of anguish that is half confusion and half fear. "Mother," she told us, that the money from the house was going to cover a philanthropic thing for the Duvant. She said they'd lend us support in return. Mark's explanation was fragile, like thin glass. "She wanted to make us part of something bigger," he added, and I could hear him trying to make his own hurt less sharp. "I signed nothing," I said. "I signed a durable power of attorney on March 28th, thinking it was a safety. I did not sign away my house. I had the receipt. I had the grant deed. I had the blue stamp of 2024-04-03. But what if a second later document had been filed? What if legally somewhere an amendment existed that spoke of funds to be earmarked for another's property? I found myself thinking like a woman who had been outmaneuvered on a chessboard she never agreed to play. There was a late document recorded on April 15th. On July 2nd, I took the bus to the county recorder's office. It is a place of slow hands and helpful clerks. They found a file. Grant deed transfer, property formerly of Marie Laurent, recorded 2024-0415. I felt as though someone had taken my name from a book and underlined it in an unfamiliar color. I asked for copies. The clerk, gentle and a little bored from years of bureaucracy, handed me a sheaf with neat stamps and signatures. There, beneath the blue ink, was a name I did not expect. It was not the buyer's, not the bank's. It was Lila's in-law, Mathieu Duvant. His signature curled like an ornate cane. It is one thing to read betrayal on a paper. It is another to feel it crawl down your spine in ink. The document stated that a partial assignment of proceeds would be made, and it referenced a trust amendment dated 2024-0401, one that authorized allocation of funds toward the acquisition of a dwelling described as Penthouse unit. Address withheld. It listed a sum, approx. $120,000 allocated, and the phrase, for family convenience and mutual benefit. For whom? For convenience? Who benefits when a mother loses a house? I sat on the bench outside the recorder's office, and people passed by with their dogs and their coffee, like a world I no longer knew. The mason jar was emptying in my hands. The pearls felt cold. I called Mark and told him the truth I had found. He came that evening. He sat at my little kitchen table, the same table where his boyhood scraps were once cleared, and he clasped my hand like a boy seeking absolution he did not deserve. I never wanted to believe it, he said. You should have told me before you sold, but I understand why you did. But if she has taken advantage, has she? I asked. Has she taken advantage, or did she orchestrate the taking? He looked away. The answer was a small thing seen in the eyes. He did not want to know. At the bottom of the document, a second signature appeared. There, near the bottom, almost like an afterthought, was a witness signature, a notary public's neat stamp, and beneath it, a second name I recognized from my daughter's parties, Mr. Alexandre Marchand, a lawyer who had once offered me a polite nod at an art opening. The document had, beneath its proper seals, the thin thread that would embroider the bigger truth. I locked the papers in the small cupboard beneath my sink. I placed the pearls on top of them like a counterweight, an altar of contradictions. I did not sleep that night. I woke before dawn and sat with the chipped mug. The tea was bitter, like truth. And yet, even in the first chapter of Hurt, the old woman in me kept a small curiosity. You must know this. You can be both wounded and curious. The wound tells you what to protect. The curiosity maps the way to it. One Dumas-like aside before the storm grows louder. When men plot with paper, they believe themselves as gods. When women remember with heart, they become historians of the soul. I will stop here for tonight, but not because the story is finished. I stop because the next step is one that will wrench open secrets designed to remain hidden. I will say only this before I leave you on the edge of that slow cliff. I put the mason jar, the pearls, and the grant deed together, and felt a weight that was more than money. It was my life. A final micro cliffhanger to keep the air trembling. I went back to the bank the next morning, and what I found there changed everything. You must forgive an old woman who paces her thoughts like a cat in the window. There are many sharp edges that need testing before I strike. After the papers from the county recorder sat in my small cupboard like coals, I moved as a woman with nothing left to lose except the truth. At first, I did the small, sensible things. I made lists. There is a romance to lists for older minds. They reduce the vast theater of life to footnotes, and footnotes can be checked. I wrote down dates and places. Grant deed signed 2024 or 403 at 3:15 p.m. Durable power of attorney signed 2024 0328 at 10:30 a.m. Trust amendment allegedly dated 2024 0401. Recorder's entry, grant deed transfer, recorded 2024 04 to 15. Amounts, sale approximately $230,000. Allocation to Penthouse listed as approx $120,000. I wrote down names like a rosary: Lila Duvant, Mathieu Duvant, Alexandre Marchand, and the gentle Mr. Patel who had first steadied my hands with legal terms. I washed those names in my memory until each letter gleamed. I had to learn the language of lawyers without swallowing their arrogance. I learned that assignation of proceeds is not a loaf at the baker's, but the sort of thing that can make or break a woman's life. I learned that trust amendment can be as deadly as a poisoned needle. Knowing the name of the weapon gives you some chance at defense. The first ally came unexpectedly in the form of a small, humming engine of kindness, Elena Marchand. She is not the lawyer himself. She is his assistant, quiet and quick, the kind of person who takes notes and disappears. I met her on a rainy Thursday outside a dry cleaner where I was trying to rescue a cardigan that still smelled faintly of my husband. She had draped a scarf the color of a bruise around her neck and carried a thermos that leaked stories. I suppose there is a kitchen table in every woman. Ours met on that pavement. Your daughter is very collected, she said, with a careful smile that suggested she meant more than the weather. She had a look in her eye I remembered from my own youth, the look of someone who has seen the inside of a room and wondered about the dust on the furniture. I said nothing at first, because I had learned the art of listening in the long winters. She, in turn, began to fill her thermos for me with small confidences. Mr. Marchand has been busy, she said. There were late nights in the office in April. Files moved at odd hours. Her voice was a sutured thing, wary, as if she had to step around barbs of loyalty. I did not ask for the whole truth because truths are heavy, and she did not lay them down at once. But she laid enough out of the basket that I could see the shape of a fraud. She told me about a night. April 18th, 2024 at approximately 11:45 p.m., when she was asked to scan and email an amended trust document. It arrived in draft, she whispered, from a private address. The signature looked like yours, Mrs. Laurent. I did not think to question. Why not? I asked, surprised by how my voice kept even its stitches. Because we were told it was routine. We were told that the client, Mathieu, needed his portion documented before a closing. She put the thermos to her lips like a clergyman offering sacrament. And then on April 20th, there was an instruction to change the header. Someone asked me to delete the original scan and replace it with a cleaner one. Her hands fluttered, and for the first time she looked like a young woman witnessing something she could not undo. I asked for everything: emails, metadata, timestamps. The word metadata sounds cold, like an engineer who has never loved a person. But metadata is truth wearing its bones. IP addresses, server timestamps, sender routing. These are the fingerprints people forget to wipe when they plot. Elena, bless her retiring heart, gave me a USB stick. Inside were emails threaded with dates, chain headers showing a private email sent from an address tied to Mathieu Duvant on April 17th, a message to amendtrustmarchandlaw.com with attachments. There were subsequent messages from the firm's account instructing process immediately. The attachments held scanned images of a document with a signature that resembled my own. But here is the clasp at which I hung my entire combative nature. The file properties showed creation times of April 20th, 2024, and the email headers showed the PDF was attached at 11:47 p.m., April 18, which was after I had already signed and recorded the grant deed on April 3rd. The real clincher, one that made me feel at once foolish and clever, was that the PDF's embedded XMP metadata carried the machine name of the law firm computer and an indicator that the file had been last modified on April 19th by a user logged in as Marchand Admin. In plain terms, the trust amendment dated April 1st was likely a fabrication backdated to sit neatly before the sale. Someone had redrawn the calendar to suit their appetite. I read and reread those headers until my eyes blurred like two small moons. The thing I had feared, what you suspect at that attic edge of thought, was true. Dates could be forged on paper, but computer metadata remembers when it was made. Paper is proud of its dignity. Metadata is the diary. I held the email header like a dagger. When I showed these to Mr. Patel, He pinched his mouth in a way that had the wisdom of someone who had seen too many small tragedies repeated with legalese. "Mrs. Laurent," he said slowly, "this is promising evidence. The headers and XMP metadata can support a claim of forgery and fraud in court. We can subpoena server logs, we can request the original scanned files and a chain of custody. But you must prepare for the other side to fight dirty. They will call you senile or suggest your signature is inconsistent." He looked at me with an odd tenderness. "You must be strong." "Strong?" I asked. My hands found the mason jar and the coins made a small, tremulous music. "I sold a house, and now I must be strong enough to pull the teeth of those who think they can eat my name. We built a small plan like children building a fortress. Gather hard evidence, get sworn affidavits, and prepare to file a complaint in the Superior Court. We needed the email headers preserved, the USB authenticated, and, most importantly, someone from the inside to say what they had seen. Elena agreed to sign an affidavit. She left her keycard log in the office for us to subpoena. Mr. Patel wrote a letter to the firm's counsel requesting voluntary preservation of documents, which is a polite way to say, "Don't shred anything, or we will make you regret it." While we prepared the legal machine, I also prepared a different weapon, the truth told to neighbors and to people who had once known me and my husband. There is a social court that moves with a different speed than the legal one. If a woman's name is sullied in polite society, it can be as ruinous as a legal judgment. I wrote letters, careful, small things, inviting those who had seen us at better times to a small tea. I told stories of my husband's kindness, of Lila as a child who learned to bake bread on a Sunday afternoon. You must know, once you are accused of being a fraud in the language of law, it is often easier to be believed guilty in the language of gossip. So I threw my net wide. At the same time, I approached the bank. Bank records are a ledger that does not yield to bluster. I asked for an internal statement on the sale proceeds. The teller, a young man whose face reddened at the sight of my handwriting, led me to a manager and then to a document that hurt like a knock to the chest. A wire transfer record showing that $115,000 was disbursed to an account ending in 3347 on April 16, 2024. That account, the manager said, bore the name Duvant Properties, LLC. A subsequent $5,000 was routed as a consultancy fee to an account connected to A. Marchand. Consulting on April 18. The bank had complied with the transactions because the required paperwork, appearing to be in order, had been presented. "We acted on the documents we had," the manager said, pressing his palms together as if praying. "We will need subpoenas to release more." My coins felt suddenly heavier. The two strands, legal metadata and bank transfers, began to braid into a rope of proof. I sat up many nights reading emails on the USB by the light of my small lamp, and every click of the mouse felt like the tapping of a gavel. Elena's affidavit, when she signed it, trembled in my hands like an uncradled bird. In it, she swore that she had scanned and emailed a document on April 18th at 11:47 p.m. that had been labeled Trust Amendment dated 2024 and that she had been instructed to replace the header and to finalize the file. She wrote that Marchand had called her at 11:43 p.m. and said, "Make it look as if it was done earlier." The closing is sensitive. Her signature looked like a confession. Her name on the page was a lantern. I remember the moment I realized this would not be quiet. It was a Sunday at the small market near St. Luc Avenue, and I saw Lila laughing with Mathieu Duvant over a display of orchids. Their laughter had the brittle sound of crystal. I stood as if I were a column and watched them move like a pair of birds, oblivious to the storm beginning under their wings. I went home and wrote the complaint in longhand before Mr. Patel transcribed it. The complaint would allege undue influence, forgery, and fraudulent conveyance. The documents attached would be the not-so-innocent headers and the bank transfers, a Dumas-like moral aside at mid-turn. When men surround themselves with paper and call it destiny, they mistake convenience for providence. When women keep the small, stubborn truths, they become the historians of justice. Once you decide to fight, You have to decide how public you will let the fight become. I chose to make it public enough to warn the community that my name was not for sale. I filed a civil complaint on July 24, 2024 at 9:15 a.m., asking the court to declare the trust amendment void ab initio, and for a temporary restraining order to freeze the proceeds pending a full hearing. The court clerk took my filings with the kind of seriousness you give a thunderbolt. They stamped the receipt received 2024-07-24-09-1642. I taped that stamp to the inside of my shawl as if it were a medal. Now the stage had to be set. When the opposing counsel, Mr. Marchand himself, received the papers, he did not write a charming note. Rather, he sent a letter that read like a challenge. "Mrs. Laurent," the letter began, "we regret to see that you have chosen to sully the reputation of our firm. Please be advised we will vigorously defend our client and seek sanctions for vexatious litigation, should this complaint proceed without merit." I remember the way the letter smelled of lavender and law. I thought of the pearls in my velvet pouch and the mason jar with a smudge of old glue where labels once were. There is a truth about adversaries. When they are cornered, they often lash out not where it hurts the most, but where it looks easiest. And then the unexpected happened. On July 28th, the day I had hoped to hand a copy of my complaint to a reporter and feel the small embers of public opinion, I received a call. The voice on the other end was Mark's, breathless. "They've done something, Mama. They filed emergency papers this morning." I felt as if someone had plucked the strings of my chest. "What papers?" I asked. He read the header. "Petition for appointment of temporary conservator, filed. 2024-07-28. 08:05 a.m., alleging incapacity." The petition was notarized, with the same Marchand firm's notary stamp. It stated in bureaucratic compassion that I had exhibited declining cognitive capacity, that I had become unable to manage affairs, and that it would be in my best interest for a conservator to be appointed, namely, Lila. If the legal world was a chessboard, they had just flipped the board and pronounced me the unstable piece. They had claimed, with the clinical politeness of those who make the rules, that I was unfit. They called me unfit in fine, polite script. There are many cruelties in law, but the cruelest is the quiet one. A judge can, on paper and with little fanfare, hand your life to someone else's custody. I felt the mason jar in my hands like a bell with no clapper. How do you fight when the law itself designs a broom to sweep you away? I called Mr. Patel and we both felt the thin rasp of panic. He told me what I already suspected. A petition for conservatorship can be filed ex parte and, if persuasive, can grant temporary control to a petitioner before the respondent can defend herself. We had evidence, yes, but evidence moves through courts like water through a sieve, slow, and subject to many obstructions. At 10 a.m. the same morning, a deputy arrived at my rented apartment with a stack of papers and a kindness that barely hid his official purpose. He read me the short, sharp phrase, "Notice of hearing, emergency conservatorship petition, returnable. 2024-0802-09 a.m. It sounded like a sentence to me. "We have to act fast," Mr. Patel said, and I could hear him from his office like a bell in the fog. "We will file an objection to the conservatorship today. We will attach Elena's affidavit, the email headers, and the bank records, and we will ask for a hearing as soon as possible." I worked like a woman sewing up a winter coat. Mr. Patel drafted an opposition, and we went to the courthouse. The hall smelled of wax and ambition. A clerk, whose shoes clicked the way time does when it is being counted, looked at our packet and sighed. "You're in for a fight," she said, which is what clerks say when they want to be kind. Before the hearing, I insisted on one small courtesy. I wanted to see the original trust amendment they asserted as true. With Mr. Patel's help, we issued a request, and to my astonishment, the firm agreed to voluntary production of the original document. Perhaps because they thought they had nothing to fear, perhaps because they mistook my exhausted appearance for acquiescence. The envelope came sealed. We broke the seal in the conference room of the courthouse library, and I held the cold paper as if it were a dove. My fingers trembled not with age alone, but with what I have since called prophetic anger. The trust amendment bore my name, a notary stamp, and a date of April 1st, 2024. Everything on its face was correct. But in a corner, someone, either in a hurry or in arrogance, had left a tiny fingerprint in the ink where an erasure had been made. Mr. Patel looked at it under a magnifier and said, "This is not simply an imprint. It's consistent with chemical abrasion." Translation: the date or the numerals might have been altered after the fact. There was a smudged fingerprint in the ink. Then, what changed everything, Elena produced a recording. She had been so frightened when she first came forward. "I shouldn't have kept it," she said, "but when Marchand called that night, I pressed the record button on my phone. He told me to handle the backdating," she whispered. Her hand shook when she handed me the tiny device. "I never wanted to go against you. I do not know when a human heart is hardest, when it is humbled by kindness or when it is hardened by treachery." I pressed play, and in the small room the voices came, crooked and small like street lamps through rain. It was Marchand's voice, a sound I had heard in polite chambers, now coarse. "Do it like this," he said. "Make the date April 1st. We need it to predate the closing. After the deed's recorded, wire the funds to Duvant Properties. Do not leave a trail." "And her signature?" Mathieu's voice asked, cool as ceramic. "We'll supply a scanned copy and make it look consistent. Send it to Elena with instructions," Marchand replied. There it was, the sound of men arranging the theft of a life. My hands, which had once kneaded dough and tied shoelaces, shook so violently I feared I would drop the recorder. It was enough. It was final. It was the law's kindling. A Dumas-like moral aside before the final confrontation. Men think themselves actors upon a vast stage. They forget that every stage has a light with a name, truth, and when the light is turned upon them, their masks will melt. I stood up. I felt, for the first time since the day my husband's breath left him, a steady clarity. There was no going back. They had lied with documents. They had moved money. They had attempted to render me voiceless. I would, with whatever remained of my stubborn bones, answer. But just as I was about to walk into the clerk's office to file our formal opposition to the conservatorship with the audio and Elena's affidavit taped to it, someone shouted outside. A voice, high and shrill, that I recognized as Lila's, announced to the world something designed to fracture the ground beneath my feet. I stepped into the corridor and saw through the courthouse windows a small crowd gathering. Cameras, too shiny to be truly domestic, were arriving. A man with a microphone approached, breathless, and thrust the device toward Lila, who stood with Mathieu at her side. "Mrs. Laurent," the microphone man said, "we heard there's a dispute over the sale of your home. Mrs. Duvant says the funds were intended for family security. What do you say?" Lila did not look like someone asking for charity. She looked like someone launching a counterattack. "I'm only trying to protect the family's legacy," she said, and her words hit me like pebbles. "My mother has been vulnerable. The family pooled resources, about $120,000, to secure a penthouse for my in-laws. I did it out of love." Mathieu's smile was the kind of smile that slides into the camera knowing the angle. The microphones blurted their shallow sympathy. A reporter asked, "Does this mean Mrs. Laurent is unfit to live alone?" And the cameras hummed like bees. I felt then an old and very particular rage, the rage of being painted as the problem when you are the victim. They had made me into the spectacle. The conservatorship papers were not merely legal. They were a performance of my weakness meant to be broadcast. I clenched my fist so hard the pearls in my pocket bit into my palm. I had the recordings. I had the email headers. I had bank records. I had Elena's affidavit. But the other side had already moved the public chessmen. They had arranged the narrative of my incapacity. My proof, as smart as it was, now had to swim through not only judges and clerks, but through a public already primed to believe me fragile. I realized with the chill of an autumn window that the next move would not simply be legal. It would be theatrical and decisive. The cameras were coming closer. I stepped back into the courthouse, clutching the recorder like a talisman. Mr. Patel's eyes were sharp as knives. He whispered, We file now, and we ask the judge to enjoin the conservatorship until a full hearing. We will present the recording and the headers as emergency evidence. I straightened my shoulders as if I were putting on an armor made of quilts. I felt like an actress about to play the truest role of my life. The complaint was big and the stakes were larger than my brittle bones. I felt young in a way I had not in decades. And then, less than an hour before I would stand before the judge, there was a knock on the courthouse door that sounded like a hammer striking glass. A deputy brought in a small envelope, and the clerk frowned as he read its contents aloud. Notice of ex parte temporary restraining order, filed by Duvant Properties. LLC, order to freeze assets and restrict access. Effective immediately, he said. The words were a bandage thrown across a wound. They cut off our breath. The envelope contained a stamped court order that gave the bank instructions to freeze certain accounts referenced by the Duvant filing. The clerk's hand hovered over the telephone, and I felt, as if under a lamp, the sudden absence of warmth. They had frozen the accounts before my complaint could be heard. I stood, my small body rigid as a statue. The recorder sat heavy and hot in my palm. I could feel the eyes of the courthouse on me like rain. The Duvants had not merely plotted to take. They had planned a preemptive lock. They knew the law's levers. They had pulled them with a swift and practiced hand. Something else arrived then, a small, neat envelope with my name on it in Lila's accurate hand. Inside, folded like a confession, was a single sheet. For your safety, Maman, Lila wrote. We only want to protect you from yourself. You are not well. We love you. Under those words was a signature that hardened me, Lila Duvant. The letter smelled faintly of lilies and of new money. I felt the room tilt. I had the proof, but the countermeasure was active. There was little time and the legal machine is slow, but the public is often swifter. The judge's calendar, the bank's compliance, the reporter's cameras, all moved in different directions. I thought then of my husband's handwriting and of the mason jar. And I made a choice I will not regret. I would not cower. I would fight in the bright, messy light of the world. I folded the recorder into my pocket. Mr. Patel took the evidence and began to type with the speed of someone summoning a storm. Elena stood in the corridor, looking pale but set. Mark was at my elbow, his face a child's shuttered grief. We prepared to ask the judge for an immediate injunction against the temporary conservatorship and for a hearing on the validity of the trust amendment. We would present the emails, the audio, the bank statements, the notary mark, and Elena's affidavit. The law will, in its best moments, be the instrument of a woman's small revenge. And then, at 3:02 p.m., as I was buttoning my coat, there came a soft click at my back, the sound of a lock. I turned, and there stood a man in a suit I recognized by the curve of his tie and the smoothness of his smile, Alexandre Marchand. He looked at me the way someone looks at an interesting but inconvenient antique. Marie, he said, as if we were at a tea and not at the edge of war. I am very sorry you feel the need to make public accusations. But do consider, there is a grandchild who needs stability. Think of how this will look. His hand, before I could process the movement, produced a paper and laid it on the table, an affidavit sworn by a physician attesting to my cognitive decline with tests supposedly administered on July 22nd. The name of the physician was one I had seen before on an advertisement for a geriatric clinic, but I had never met him. The affidavit bore a signature and a date. He placed a medical affidavit on the table. Mr. Patel picked up the affidavit and read. His face, which had been a blade, now flickered like a candle. We will challenge this, he said. But the court may act on that affidavit before our evidence is fully considered. I felt the air rush from my chest. They had anticipated my every move. They had not merely forged dates and arranged transfers. They had recruited medicine as an accomplice. In one swift series of motions, they had attempted to quiet my voice, lock my funds, and declare me unfit, all while painting themselves as protectors. I will tell you this and mean each word with the weight of my bones. I sat down and I laughed. It was not a laugh of relief. It was the laugh of a woman who has been pushed to the edge and finds a foothold not of fury, but of clarity. "If they think my heart will bend," I said softly, to no one in particular, "they are mistaken." Marchand smiled, an actor in a tragedy. "We have gone to some lengths to protect the family," he said. "You are making this difficult." I touched the pearls in my pocket until they sang softly. The world outside the courthouse windows had not yet learned the full story. The cameras were now more numerous, and a reporter's van idled like a beetle. I thought of the mason jar, which I had kept because it recorded in coins the accrual of small sacrifices. I thought of the boy who screamed about a penthouse, and how loud a single sentence can be when you wish to make someone else the villain. I had the proof. I had the evidence. I was ready to file and to shout and to make their polished world less comfortable. But they had pulled a defensive cord I had not anticipated, the invocation of my frailty. I felt as if I were on the edge of the theater door, about to step into the stage lights and then be told I had no right to act. They had bound my wrists with paper before the curtain rose. The judge's hands would be the next to speak. The law in its glory is merciful. The law, however, in the hands of men like those gathered against me, can be a blunt instrument. I would have to show more than a recording. I would have to show a life lived that contradicts their picture of a woman who could not manage her own affairs. I would have to fashion my dignity into evidence. So I did the only thing left altogether honest. I went to the court window where the cameras could see me, and I spoke, calm, clear, with the small authority of a woman who has baked bread for generations. I told my story in short sentences that cut like knife ships through fog. The sale, the dates, the pearls, the mason jar, the husband's letter, the emails, the bank transfers, the recording. I told it simply because I had to. People who had known me stood in the crowd and nodded. Some wept, and yet, before the gavel could pronounce anything, before the lawyer could pull out his last charm, before the judge had seen the recording in its full honestity, the courthouse doors opened and, in a move that felt orchestrated like a finale, I received a phone call that made the world tilt in another way. My number flashed on the screen as unknown, and when I answered, a voice I had loved once said 3 words that would change the map of this fight. "Don't come, Marie." It was my son Mark. His voice was small, urgent, and full of a terrible resignation I did not know he possessed. "You cannot win this way," he said. "They've said they'll take everything, and if they can't get it in court, they'll take it another way. Don't go to court, please." I thought then of Dumas and fortunes crumbling and redemptions delayed. I thought of a miser who, when shown a way to steal the last candle of an old woman, would snuff it out and call it prudence. My hand tightened on the recorder in my pocket. I felt the ground shift under me, a final micro cliffhanger to close this part. The judge tapped his pen. The courtroom hushed. I opened my mouth to speak, and the bailiff announced, "Sheriff's deputy at the door with an order of attachment." The sheriff's deputy unfolded the court order like it was a map to a grave. "Order of attachment filed 2024-7/28-1502, he read, his voice a polite knife. "This orders the bank to freeze accounts specified in Exhibit A, pending resolution of claims by Duvant Properties, LLC. He tapped the paper with a finger that smelled faintly of coffee and old keys. "We were instructed to serve it immediately." For a moment I felt lightheaded, as if I were standing on the roof of the house I had sold and the tiles had slid beneath my feet. Frozen accounts. Attachment. "They can't just—" I started, but my voice was small, brittle as an icicle. The recorder in my pocket thumped like a second heart. Mr. Patel did not blink. He folded his hands and said, with that particular kind of calm that lawyers use when they are about to call a storm, "We have to counter this now. Emergency motion to dissolve the attachment, present ex parte evidence that the transfer was fraudulent, and request immediate provisional relief. We will also seek to vacate the conservatorship in light of newly produced materials." "Ex parte?" the deputy repeated. He was used to forms and boxes, not to women who came to court with their lives in their hands. "That means it can be done without them present?" "Sometimes," Mr. Patel said. when the public interest and the risk of irreparable harm to the petitioner require it. Irreparable harm. I swallowed. They had not merely taken money, they had sought to take my life's agency. There is, I have learned, a difference between losing money and losing the right to live by your own choices. The latter hurts deeper. We moved with the speed of people who have learned that the law, though deliberate, has windows that open and close like trapdoors. Mr. Patel stormed into the clerk's office, his voice effusive with purpose, and I followed with the recorder like a rosary. Cameras clustered like starlings outside the courthouse, someone live-streaming, someone else already composing a headline. The air smelled of rain and hot tar. The city was a kettle on a low boil. At 9 a.m. on August 2, 2024, we faced Judge Marianne Roche, a woman known for a brow that held both sympathy and iron. The courtroom had the hush of a theater before the overture. Reporters lined the gallery, their pens itching. Lila was there, flawless as a painted portrait, sitting close to Mathieu. Marchand had a face like someone reading his own program at the end of an opera and finding the lead role staring back at him. Mr. Patel began with the essentials. Copies of the email headers showing ND, April 18, 2024 transmission, the XMP metadata showing file modification on April 19th. Elena Marchand's sworn affidavit, noting that she had been instructed to backdate the trust amendment. The bank's wire transfer records showing $115,000 wired to Duvant Properties, LLC on April 16th and $5,000 to an account linked to A. Marchand Consulting on April 18th. And finally, the recording. Elena's small device that would, like a lantern, illuminate dark corners. Judge Roche listened. Her gaze rested on me for a long moment, and then it settled on Elena when Mr. Patel called her to the stand. Elena recounted, voice trembling sometimes and steady other times, the late-night instructions, Marchand's voice over the phone, the handle the backdating clause, the pressure to finalize the document. She handed over the phone and all the emails. When the recorder was played, Marchand's calm, cultivated voice issued across the room, directions given like a conductor instructing the brass. The sound of the recording in that courtroom seemed to rearrange the air. Marchand's smile tightened. Mathieu shifted. Lila's face grew pinched, as if the microphone were a small, accusing thing. The recording played and the room went very still. There are moments in life when you feel like an insect in the throat of a music box, but then the music changes and you find you are the very hand that winds it. I felt that hand. I felt the shifting of scales. Judge Roche asked a quiet question. Mr. Marchand, did you instruct your staff to alter document dates? His reply was polished. Your Honor, any suggestion of impropriety is unfounded. The documents presented by Mrs. Laurent are, at best, misinterpreted. He smiled with a practiced solicitor's smile that seeks to make moral panic seem like poor vision. Mr. Patel laid out the metadata, walked the judge through timestamps with the patience of someone who has taught children to read, and then called the bank manager to testify regarding the wire origin and the beneficiary accounts. The manager, who had earlier seemed almost apologetic, now testified with the gravity of a man explaining a ledger's bloodstains. He confirmed the disbursements and revealed something that made a few pens scratch nervously. The $115,000 to Duvant Properties, LLC had been flagged as disbursed per instruction, attached to grant deed, dated April 15, and the wire had occurred on April, after the grant deed had been recorded on April 3rd, indicating a subsequent transfer authorized by the amended trust, the MI. Judge's pen scratched. If these records are accurate, she said, we are looking at transactions facilitated by a document that may have been falsified to predate a closing. I will take this under advisement and issue an order pending further evidentiary submissions. And then, in a move that felt almost cinematic, Judge Roche turned to the clerk and signed a modest-sounding but tremendous order. She would demand immediate preservation of all accounts in question, call for a forensic analysis of the emails and the documents' ink and paper, and, crucially, Suspend any action on the conservatorship petition until the forgery claim could be more fully considered. She ordered the attachment to be narrowly tailored, a hold on the disputed proceeds, but not on my small personal checking account that paid my rent and utilities. Relief, when it comes, is often a small domestic thing. The clerk handed me a copy of the order stamped, issued 2024-08-02-1437. I pressed it to my chest and felt the truth of it like a warm bread. The judge suspended the conservatorship, temporarily, but victory is not linear in these stories. The moment the judge stepped down, the other machinery whirred: public opinion, the press, and the small cruel decisions people make when they seek to separate themselves from scandal. Lila, sensing the breeze shift, launched a counter-strategy in the papers. An op-ed, written in a voice that pretended magnanimity, titled, "Protecting What Matters, A Daughter's Duty." She framed her actions as protective love, painted me as fragile and in need of care, and cast herself as a steward. The headlines spread like an oil slick. There is a cruelty in headlines. They make stories shorter and people's hearts smaller. Friends called, some with sympathy, some with silence. Mark called and said haltingly, "I'm proud of you." "Maman." He came to court and sat quietly, holding my hand beneath the bench. The bank complied with the judge's order and placed a narrow freeze on $115,000 and the $5,000 consultancy payment pending forensic analysis. That was not full restitution, but it was a headland from which to fight. Meanwhile, Mr. Patel filed criminal referrals with the district attorney for forgery, fraud, and conspiracy, attaching Elena's affidavit, the email headers, and the recording. The DA's office responded with cautious interest and, by August 10th, had launched a preliminary inquiry. There are offices like those that will not move until a jury of evidence arrives. I could feel the gears turning. The district attorney opened a preliminary inquiry. Public pressure is a strange ally. It can act like rain on brittle leaves. You don't know whether it will nourish or wash them away. I decided to use it. I asked the local paper for a meeting and told them everything in my old woman's unvarnished voice. The mason jar, the pearls, the cracked mug, the April dates, the phone call, the recording. They ran a piece that was not snappy but human. The author described me not as an object of pity, but as an elder with steely regard and an appetite for justice. The article reached a few corners I had only dreamt of. A small legal aid blog quoted Elena's affidavit. A lawyer in a neighboring county sent a note of support. An old school friend wrote to say she would testify about my soundness of mind in May 2024. The threads gathered. Lila's circle began to feel some chill. A donor withdrew a promised gift from the gala she had been planning. A social acquaintance texted that their invitation list had changed. Humiliation, when it arrives, is often not an arrest but a social refrigeration. I did not seek their shame for pleasure, but for remedy. People who had once been ready to cut both of us adrift began to pause and ask questions. And then, in mid-August, the DA's office moved. They issued subpoenas to Marchand's firm for internal logs and to the email hosting company for IP routing. The forensic report, when it came back weeks later, was meticulous. The PDF that bore the date 2024-0401 had been created on April 19, 2024. Its embedded metadata showed user Marchand admin. Ink analysis on the physical amendment the firm had produced revealed erasures consistent with an altered numeral. The forensic analyst's report, dry and irresistible, stated, in plain English, that the document displayed indicators of post-creation alteration. The DA added charges of fraud and forgery to the investigation. I remember closing my eyes and resting my head against the kitchen wall that had once been painted by my husband's careful hand. We are not magnets for trouble, I told myself. We are lighthouses for truth. I say this foolishly and proudly. Sometimes the smallest lamp can make a vast darkness negotiable. Dumas-like moral aside before the final act. Where men make empires of paper and think themselves immortal, time and truth are patient generals. They do not rush, but they always arrive. When the small and honest woman keeps her witness, she becomes, in time, the archivist of justice. The criminal process moved like a dignified animal. Charges were discussed. Marchand was interviewed. Mathieu's accounts were scrutinized. The DA's office, by the end of September, had enough to file charges and they issued arrest warrants. Civil processes are not always as swift as hunger, but criminal culpability has a certain appetite for certainty. On September 30th, 2024, I sat in the courtroom as Marchand and Mathieu were arraigned, their faces flushed with a realization that the spotlight can burn. But the most delicate thing of all to reclaim was not the money in a bank. It was my name, my right to speak and to be believed. The conservatorship petition was formally dismissed on October 7, 2024. Judge Roche wrote in her order, "Given the evidence presented demonstrating probable cause of fraudulent activity and the questionable provenance of documents relied upon by petitioner, the court finds insufficient basis at this time to appoint a conservator for Marie Laurent." The order carried with it the small sound of a seal closing. I had my life back. The conservatorship petition was dismissed. There is a scene from my childhood I have not yet told you. My father, when a storm smashed their roof, insisting that dignity is not an expense but a necessity. I thought of him, and I thought of the mason jar. The bank returned the frozen funds to an escrow account pending civil resolution. It was not yet mine to spend, but it was contained, no longer like smoke in the hands of those who would make castles for themselves with stolen bricks. The civil trial, where we sought rescission of the transfer and restitution, took place in November. The courtroom was full. Neighbors, old friends, even some of Lila's acquaintances who had quietly decided that bad company should not be their company. The DA's agent was present with his file. Evidence was presented: email metadata, the recording played again, Elena's affidavit, and bank transfer logs. Marchand's defense was technical and embittered. Mathieu's argument turned on plausible deniability and the welfare of family unity. Lila wept at times, tears like tiny buttons catching on fabric, and the court observed her sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with pity. The judge's ruling in December managed that splendid balance of legalism and poetry. She voided the trust amendment as a nullity, ordered rescission of the fraudulent assignment, and mandated restitution of $120,000 to the estate of the sale, plus punitive damages of $25,000 and attorney's fees. The order read instructions for the bank to reverse the wire if possible and to hold the remainder of funds pending final accounting. Additionally, Judge Roche recommended referral to the County Bar Association for inquiry into Marchand's professional conduct. The DA's office filed a criminal indictment in January, and Marchand and Mathieu faced trial for fraud and forgery. The headlines rang like church bells: justice moving, cumbersome, and real. The judge ordered restitution and referred Marchand to the bar. What followed was quieter and more domestic, exactly the sort of justice I had wanted. The house where Lila had once hung a portrait of our family had, in time, a different portrait: invitations withdrawn, a gala reduced, a penthouse purchase abandoned when the Duvant's source of funds came under inquiry. Reputation, which is sometimes the currency of the modern, can deflate faster than balloons at the end of a parade. Neither public ruin nor courtroom victory brings back the vanished hours, but it makes possible the slow art of repair. Mark reconciled with me properly one rainy November afternoon, bringing my favorite soup and a promise to help me move into a comfortable apartment with a balcony. He admitted with a childish redness that he had been afraid to know too much and that fear had made him silent. "Forgive me, Maman," he said, and it was as if a stitch were being sewed into a wound that would otherwise never close. As for Lila, the consequence was not only legal. The community's trust is a delicate vase. Her name, once associated with refined parties and tasteful generosity, now carried a sigh. She apologized tentatively at first, publicly at a small gathering, and privately she visited once and left with a letter explaining that she needed time. I will not say her punishment was theatrical. It was like a cold wind that strips leaves. Pride, when it falls, can teach. And then came perhaps the simplest justice of all. My name in the property record was intact. The proceeds were returned to an escrow to be distributed according to law. The bank provided a modest settlement for their procedural mishandling, and the pearls, my old pearls, were safe in the pocket of my dress where I had kept them. I bought a new chipped mug with the first check. And when I drank tea that afternoon, the taste seemed of victory and chamomile. There is a strange, human thing that happens after one survives a battle. You measure what remains. My apartment's balcony sprouted basil and rosemary. The mason jar returned to its place on the windowsill, still half full with the coins of a careful life. Friends visited, and I told my story often, not to reopen wounds, but so that the fragile might learn the strength of being attentive. I paid Mr. Patel and Elena with money, and with a dinner where the tablecloth was ironed and the soup was too hot. Elena thanked me with a quick, embarrassed smile and said, "You are a strong woman, madame. I only wish I had acted sooner." I kept the mason jar on the sill. There are mornings when the sun slants through the blinds and makes the pearls look like small moons. I sit in my chair and count not coins but breaths. I tell you now, because that is how I live, by telling, this is not only a tale of fraud and cunning. It is a hymn to the small moralities that bind a life. Notice the coins, notice the signature on a letter. Speak when you see a shadow in a child's face. Poetic justice arrived. In the end, not as a dramatic striding of masked avengers, but as a careful unspooling of truth and consequence, an indictment, a rescission, restitution, and in the quiet world, the withdrawal of invitations and the reassigning of social favor. These things do not mend everything, but they tilt the ledger back toward balance. If you ask me what I learned, dear listener, I will tell you without the poet's cloak. Never accept the first gentle lie as a substitute for the whole truth. The world oft prefers to believe the convenient narrative. You must keep, like a lighthouse, a bright, patient beam of curiosity and memory. Keep your receipts, your letters, your mason jars. Keep your voice. If my story touched you, then take this small request as the final grain of wisdom. Share it with someone who needs courage today. Tell an elder's story, listen harder to the pauses in your family, and if you see something that feels wrong, investigate with kindness. And if you would like to hear more of these small epics from an old woman who has seen enough storms to know which way the wind blows, subscribe, leave a comment, and pass this on. My heart is old, but it beats like a rebellious drum, and I have many more truths yet to tell.